Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today I'm welcoming Jack Shitama to the show. Jack is an author, teacher, speaker, and coach. His family systems approach to leadership helps congregations and nonprofit leaders achieve their best physically, spiritually, and professionally. He is an avid learner with a passion for taking the most recent secular learnings and applying them to spiritual leadership. Jack is also an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and currently serves as the executive director at Pecometh Camp Retreat Ministries in Centreville, Maryland. He is also the director of the Center for Vital Leadership. Jack is the author of 3 books, including Anxious Church, Anxious People, How to Lead Change in an Age of Anxiety. Jack and his wife of 40 years, Jody, have 4 adult children and 3 grandchildren. Jack is an avid runner and has completed the Baltimore Marathon 3 times. He plays guitar and bass in the Jacob's Well Band, his church's worship band. He enjoys all kinds of sports, cooking, reading, traveling, and most of all, seeing people experience spiritual growth. All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined today by Jack Shitama. Jack, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Jack has actually been a guest before, but way back in my early days. So we'll kind of go through some similar questions. If folks are really dedicated listeners, they might have heard these before, but I wanted to share for folks who may not be familiar with you or perhaps forgot from way back in that episode. But share a little bit about yourself, kind of about your faith journey, what that looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Sure. I didn't grow up in a church-going family. My parents are not Christians. They are. Well, my dad passed away, but they were good, hardworking, secular, middle-class people. And it wasn't until my latter part of my 20s that I really started searching spiritually. And I ran into a couple people who really got me thinking about Jesus through their own testimony. And it was through that I prayed this prayer one day. This was kind of the beginning of my faith, I think, where I just prayed, Jesus, if you are who they say you are, show me. And he did. I actually went home and I said to my wife, I want to start going to church. And God was working on her. She said, me too. She had grown up in the United Methodist Church. We started going to the church in which we were married, her home church. And after about a year, I think I got into a Bible study, and that's really what opened up my life and felt a call to ministry. I was baptized in January of 1988, and I was in a pulpit serving as a United Methodist pastor in July of 1991. So it was like a whirlwind.
Wow. Yeah, that's a whirlwind for sure.
Yeah, and then as you know, family systems theory is a huge part of what I like to share. It's kind of been my focus in terms of leadership development, and I encountered that in my first seminary in 1991, and have been studying it ever since.
What would you say is different or more expanded about your faith versus 30 some years ago?
I think now I've really learned to live with uncertainty in much more a much healthier way, I think, than I did 30 years ago. What I've come to discover for myself is that's really what faith is, right? Faith is trusting in God to lead the way and to provide the strength. One of my favorite concepts in Christian theology is the understanding that we can do no good apart from the grace of God. So that's our concept of free will. We only have the free will to say no to God. We can't even really say yes, but if we just open ourselves up to God, then it's God's grace that leads us, that guides us, that gives us what we need. And then when we see good things happening, especially in terms of doing God's work in the world, we get to give God the credit, give God the glory. So I think that's kind of how my faith has matured.
Awesome. What are some spiritual practices that you'd recommend to others or have been meaningful for you?
Well, certainly having a prayer life is really critical, and I struggled with that off and on until probably until about 2007, and I think that really coincided with my youngest child being in high school. So mornings were not quite so hectic because I would get up early. I could get up early, and I didn't have a bunch of kids running around. So we have 4 children; they're all grown now, of course. But so I think having that prayer life where our focus is on God is really important. One of the practices that's been really meaningful to me in the last few years has been just keeping a real brief gratitude journal. And it's kind of a form of the Ignatian examen. Usually you do that at the end of the day where you kind of reflect on the day and ask what you're grateful for and what you learned and what you can do better, that type of thing. But I do it first thing in the morning and think about the previous day, and I write down the names of the people that I encountered and even the ones maybe that had difficult encounters. I feel like all of those are people to be grateful for, and there's lots of research that people who express gratitude are happier, right? It just, I think it gives us a sense of grounding, and it starts first with gratitude for God, but then gratitude for all of the other aspects of life, especially people. So I think that's the one that's most meaningful to me these days.
Yeah, simple but helpful for sure.
Yeah,
those basic.
I was going to say it only takes me. I spend maybe 5 minutes on it, 5 or 10 minutes on it. So
yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm kind of doing this backwards, but anything else you want to share about yourself that makes you you?
No, I think I'm just another guy, really. So, well, and you probably know, this isn't really, this is kind of plugging a book. I wrote a book on habit formation because for many years, I felt like I just was grinding at life. And then it really started with starting a prayer life in 2007, where I started doing things out of habit, good things out of habit. First it was prayer, then it was exercise, and it was writing. And I wish I would have known that when I was younger. I don't know. I probably wouldn't have listened. Maybe somebody did try to tell me, but I think that, learning that it's not so much about willpower and self-discipline. It's about being able to focus on developing the right kind of habits has been certainly almost as life-changing as Jesus Christ has been for me. So.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I've been thinking a lot about your tips about micro habits and micro goals. Trying to think of what are some micro goals I can start to get to my bigger goals. So that's helpful. Folks, Jack has his own podcast, the Non-Anxious Leader podcast. Highly recommend it. I've been listening to it for some time. I don't even remember how I found it, but it's all things family systems theory, leadership, habit formation. Highly recommend it. He has a couple books, 3 books I think out, right?
Yeah.
The one I finished reading a few months ago, Anxious Church, Anxious People, How to Lead Change in an Age of Anxiety. Really, I think I've read a lot of family systems theory books, Jack, and I really think this is one of the best books of just kind of laying it out in a simple, understandable way. So for listeners who are trying to get an understanding, I would highly recommend it just as a primer for family systems theory. But the reason I have Jack on here is Jack serves in the United Methodist Church. As a clergy person, I am fortunate enough to be serving in a UMC church now myself. And there's a lot of drama, I guess. Maybe that's the wrong word. A lot of stuff happening nationally, globally, within the denomination. And Jack has shared some things and perspectives on his own podcast around the denomination and possible splitting and disruption. So I thought it'd be interesting to have you talk about that from a family systems perspective. But maybe before we dive into that, I thought it might be helpful for listeners who are not familiar with what's going on in the UMC, maybe talk about just the broader background and the backstory.
Sure. So I'll start in, I believe it's 1972. My dates might not be quite accurate, but somewhere around that time, our general conference, which is our legislative body that meets only once every 4 years, passed a part of its book of discipline, and that says, which is our church law, that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And so prior to that, there was nothing even in our church law. It was only as I think people became more aware of LGBTQ persons that and probably not even the transgenders, mainly just LGB persons that the church felt like they had to speak out, and that began 4 decades of conflict. It wasn't as intense early on, but as with our country, as progressives and conservatives started to become more polarized, so our church did as well. And this is not new to mainline Protestant Christianity. The Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian Church, they've all been through this already and had denominational splits where I'm pretty sure in every case the progressive wing kept the name of the denomination, and the conservatives started a new denomination, and so we're just the last ones to do it. We thought there was supposed to be a special general conference in 2019, and we thought there was going to be a way that we could live together in which we would come to an agreement that every church got to decide whether they would be willing to host same-sex weddings. So a church couldn't be forced to do it, but a church could be allowed to do it. Every pastor could decide whether they would be willing to officiate a same-sex wedding. And each annual conference, which is each of our judicatories, like regions, each of our regions would be able to decide whether they would ordain LGBTQ persons. So we thought, this is a way we could remain a big tent. It didn't happen, and in fact, actually, the traditional or conservative wing actually gained a little bit of an some strength on that, and so things actually moved in the opposite direction. There was a lot of turmoil from there, but then a group of I'm going to say about a dozen people total, maybe 16 from each side, half from each side, got together, and they were led by the negotiator who administered the 9/11 Victims Fund. I want to say his name is Ken Feinberg, but I might be wrong about that. Anyway, they came to an agreement about how we might amicably separate. And I won't go into all the details, but the idea was that we were going to agree to disagree, and the United Methodist Church would remain a church and be able to eliminate the language about homosexuality being incompatible with Christian teaching, and that the conservative wing of the church would leave and form its own denomination called the Global Methodist Church. We were all really hopeful at that point in time, and that was going to be codified in the 2020 General Conference, which was to happen in, I believe, September of 2020, but it might have been May. Anyway, we know what happened in 2020. There were going to be no gatherings like that. They pushed it off to 2021. They pushed it off again to 2022. And then they decided that really it was it didn't make sense to do it. We would just meet again in 2024. Well,
Yeah.
that created a lot of disruption and uncertainty. Churches that wanted to leave were feeling anxious. Clergy and church members that wanted to leave were feeling anxious, and the coalition that had formed this kind of amicable separation broke down, and so now in the 2019 General Conference there was something that was passed called a disaffiliation clause, where a church could leave the denomination and take their property with them if they went through a certain process and paid a certain amount of their missional giving that they have to give to the denomination. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing a lot of churches that are going through this disaffiliation process. Interestingly, not all of them are going to the Global Methodist Church. Many of them are just want out. They want out of the franchise. They want out from having to be a part of the bigger connectional church, and so that's what's kind of creating the chaos. I know that's a long answer, but
no, that's helpful.
Yeah.
So one quick thing, I had heard somewhere like on a YouTube video about this topic that that window, so to speak, that you mentioned was closing or would be closing soon. So church or what was it? Maybe that it's kind of being forced closed. I can't remember.
So it was passed as a temporary measure in 2019, and ironically, it was passed to give progressive churches a chance to leave if they wanted. It was really passed with more traditional conservative support. But it's been because of the change in circumstances, it's now the opposite. But yeah, that window is closing 2023. They're going to have to have made their decision, which requires a 2/3 vote of all their church members. The approval of the annual conference. They have to pay. It varies from conference to conference because each conference gets to set the rules. But on average, a couple of years worth of what we call apportionments, which is our giving to the denomination, which can be pretty significant. And that all has to be paid by the end of 2023. So the window, yes, is closing.
Okay. I think what it was is there was a conference that was basically saying, we're not going to let anyone else out.
Okay.
So I can't remember what that conference was. But anyway, so a lot happening, and I don't want to get into like the nitty gritty of policies and procedures and stuff. What I want to hear that I think at least would be helpful for me, and I'm hoping would help for our listeners, is kind of, you've alluded to when I've been listening to some of your podcast episodes of like how you think this process has not been healthy from a family systems perspective. So I'd like to hear more from there.
Sure. Look, I'll go to the macro first. The bigger picture, because what this conflict would be considered in family systems theory is a classic triangle. So a triangle occurs when two people are uncomfortable with each other, their relationship. And so to avoid having to deal with that discomfort, they focus on a third person or issue. And so, a classic triangle might be in a couple, one of the partners, they're uncomfortable with each other. And so one of the partners just dives into their career, works a lot and focuses on that. That's kind of a way of avoiding the discomfort. And then so the other partner complains about, well, you're working too much. Oh, well, my boss says I have to. How come you're not home early? Well, I had to do this. And the focus is on the work, right? So they start arguing about the work instead of dealing with their own discomfort with each other. And so in the early 70s and into the 80s, as progressives and conservatives got more uncomfortable with each other, this became more and more a focus of their discomfort with each other. And I will say that this is, in family systems theory, there's this concept of things of generational transmission, things getting passed from generation to generation, and at least in Christianity in the 20th in the United States, there have been a series of things like this: slavery back in the 19th century, fundamentalism in the early 20th century, that became foci of the conflict between progressives and conservatives. So this is something that we just keep doing. And in my own denomination, not only do we have this history of these types of triangles, but we also have a history of schisms. We have a history of divorces. So the first one occurred back in 1816. It was related to race, and I don't think I don't think that's coincidental, and I'll tell you why, but in a minute. But in a church in Philadelphia, St. George's Church, it used to be that African Americans and Anglos would worship together. But in 1816, they told the African Americans they had to sit in the balcony. And Richard Allen, who was actually one of the certified lay preachers in the church, led a movement, and they walked out and they formed what is now the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And in 1821, the same thing happened at John Street in New York. African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church came out of that. We had the Methodist Protestant Church that split away in 1830 because they didn't want bishops, and so their motto was a church without a country without a king and a church without bishops. So just on. And of course, we split over slavery, and so this is in our DNA. Schism is in our DNA. The other part about that, and this is the kind of the macro, even more macro in our culture and our country. Michael Kerr, who was studying under Murray Bowen, has a theory that the United States, part of what has propelled it from its beginning was that we always had a scapegoat. And early on, you remember my podcast on that, huh? Early on, it was slaves and indigenous peoples, and we could always focus on them as the problem, the so-called problem. And that took us all the way up into the mid 20th century. But the civil rights movement, and you could say women also were considered a scapegoat. So, but this idea that all of a sudden through civil rights and women's rights, that all people were equal, and we really shouldn't oppress others and we shouldn't exploit others. This took away our scapegoat. And I don't know if it was Kerr or somebody else said what they really think it was a tipping point was the one thing that held us through that period was communism. We still could blame communism, but when the wall fell in, I think, the early 90s, that was it. And if you look at it since then, I mean, we've been fighting each other, right? Right. Because our political world is the same. And even though we still, some people still want to have like immigrants as scapegoats, or we're really using each other. We're focused on each other. And so what do we do? We in the church, we've triangled human sexuality, at least in our denomination, United Methodist Church, as a way to avoid other things. One more thing in terms of the Protestant church, Protestant mainline churches have been declining since the 60s steadily. And so talk about denial. This is a way to deny that perhaps we got comfortable, we got complacent, we became middle-class people who cared more about ourselves instead of reaching out in the name of Jesus and trying to change oppressive systems in the name of Jesus. And so what happened was over time, we focused on that issue. And you might hear people say, well, if we just got back to the basics and got back to the Bible and traditional values, we would flourish as a church. Or if we just freed ourselves from these oppressive things and became a more open church, we'll reach more people. Well, neither of those is really true. I think you could do all the things that we need to do to reach people for Jesus and bring the reign of God into the world without dealing with that issue at all. So,
so you think it's in some ways an anxiety response to the decline? You're saying?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
and just as I think our political division in the country is an anxiety response to the shift away from a system where some people are privileged, and we're trying to move to a system that's more egalitarian, even though we still have a long way to go.
Right. So that was I really appreciate the kind of macro view. Tell me more about the micro view in from an FST family systems perspective. Yeah.
So I think what from the macro view, there's nothing we can do. We're going to split just like all the others. From what I've heard from some friends and colleagues in other denominations, it gets really ugly. Mm-hmm. Feelings are hurt, relationships are broken, lawsuits are filed, money becomes central, money and assets, and it just gets really ugly. And if you think about that, if you think about all the ways that Christianity has become irrelevant to so many people, you just have to wonder what they think when they see Christians fighting like this, right?
Right.
That my biggest concern is what an awful witness it is to the grace and love of God. And so my concern at this point is that we figure out a way to move forward with the grace and love of God. And to me, what family systems theory teaches is that we can only control our own functioning, that we can only work on defining ourselves, and we can't define others. If we try to define others, we get into this so-called conflict of wills where it's all about who's right and who's wrong, and that's where we are. And so what I'm hoping is that we can teach Christian leaders to be more self-differentiated. That is, to not give in on our own principles, but to say, this is where I stand on this. I believe this is how I'm going to follow God. But then also say, but if you don't, that's okay. If you disagree with me, that's okay. Because I think if we could do that, that would be a powerful witness. If we could actually figure out a way to part and send each other off with a blessing, it would at least show to people that, okay, Christians disagree, just like the rest of the world, but Christians do it differently because of their common bond in Jesus Christ. I don't see that happening, but I'm not giving up. I'm gonna, that's what I think part of the work I feel called to do is to help people learn that it's possible and to do that. I have really close friends who we knew each other as Christian siblings even before we went into the ministry, and it's another couple that the woman went into the ministry a couple of years after I did, and then the husband a year or two after that, the man after that. So they are very traditional. I don't know if they're going to go Global Methodist Church or not. We've been trying to get together and we haven't, but we made a commitment that we would treat each other with love and grace no matter what happened. And I think we have been doing that. We're trying to do that, and that's really why I want to connect with them. I haven't actually seen them, had a conversation with them for a few years, and would love to just hear how they're doing and what they're thinking, where their God is calling them. I don't want to see them leave the denomination, but that's not up to me. Right. That's their choice, and I think that's what self-differentiation is. And what our instinct is to say, well, if they're leaving, they can't be good.
Yeah,
only
right.
the good people stay. Well,
Right.
that's a little monolithic, right?
Yeah.
So I guess we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. The conflict of wills, I want to highlight that because I feel like, I'm not sure what your perspective would be, but I feel like for me at least, it feels so prevalent in all aspects of our society right now where we're trying to define the other. And I don't know, one of my friends and colleagues, he wrote like a Substack about basically how we're, if I remember correctly, something to the effect of like we're basically trying to argue from a different kind of like source book, if that makes sense, like foundational text. And I kind of wondered about like the efficacy of saying like basically saying, this is wrong because this source says so. Meanwhile, the other group we're arguing against is going from basically has a completely different source book. Again, if to stay with a metaphor, what's a better way of functioning there?
Yeah, I mean, let's be real, right? We can't even agree on what's truth anymore, right?
Right.
Fake news and facts. If the pandemic showed us anything,
right.
We all interpret so-called facts differently, and so. And then when you go to using different source books or different interpretations of our source book, the Bible, it doesn't get us anywhere. It just gets us into deeper and deeper conflict. Adam Grant, who's a psychologist at the Wharton School of Business, he's an organizational psychologist. His most recent book is called Think Again, and he has in there 4 archetypes that come out when we're in some kind of disagreement. I won't say argument, but just disagreement. And the first he says is preacher. We'll start with preacher because we're Christians and we're clergy. So when you go into preacher mode, you're trying to convince the other person that you're right and they're wrong, right? That's what we do when we preach, right? We preach the truth. This is the truth, right?
Right.
The other is prosecutor. And in prosecutor, we're trying to convince the other person that they're wrong. We're trying to convict them, right?
Right.
We can do preacher and prosecutor in the same conversation, but I think they're helpful understandings of different ways that we get into this conflict of wills. The third is politician, which is we really don't have any principles. We're just trying to get along, and we'll say anything, so we just want to get along with the other person. And of course, what he's saying is none of those are helpful because, and my interpretation is, they either get us into a conflict of wills or the politician is a form of adaptivity, right? It's a form of just giving in to what the other person wants because we don't want to get into conflict. It's a form of conflict avoidance. And so what he says, the most helpful approach is what he calls the scientist. And what he talks about is that scientists really don't care what the truth is. They just want to learn the truth. And so they'll form a hypothesis and they'll run an experiment, and they're just as happy to find out that their hypothesis is wrong because they got closer to the truth. And actually, I was in a Bible study discussion this morning, and we were emphasizing the word curiosity. Yeah, and I think curiosity is this really helpful approach to everything, whether it's the so-called facts or whether it's a person that's in your face or, just whatever's going on in the world. When we're curious, we're less likely to be angry. We're less likely to be reactive or adaptive. And as you know, one of the things I always recommend in those anxious situations is just to listen. Right. And so curiosity and listening go hand in hand. It's going back to this couple. I was at our annual meeting of our churches. This was probably in 2016, and the woman was setting up a display for the Wesleyan Covenant Association, which is the forerunner to the Global Methodist Church. So it's the traditional conservative organization, and she was an officer of the organization, still is. And I asked, I just went up and I just said, so tell me, what are your organizational goals? What are your aims? And then I asked her, what would it take for us to keep our denomination together? And she told me, and then she asked me the same thing, and I told her, and we still weren't quite on the same page, but
right.
We weren't arguing, right? We were just sharing where we were without trying to convince the other, and that didn't change anybody's minds, but it kept our relationship intact, and so I think this idea of being curious and not trying to win the day. I think that's the problem, is we're trying to win the day, and trying to win the day is going to cause us all to lose the day, because it is going to get nasty for some people. I'm trying to just keep it from getting nasty in my own little part of the world, and perhaps help other people do the same.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you a bunch more family systems questions here, but I got to keep focused and get back on track to the UMC discussion here. Let me ask you maybe two more questions here before we take a break. What do you think will happen, and maybe what do you think should happen?
Well, the should would be that when we meet in 2024, we formalize some kind of actual amicable separation. But by then it might be too late.
Yeah.
So what should happen right now is people should give each other a break. They should understand that we don't agree, and that people of Christian conscience, can disagree, and that we all just need to relax a little bit, So I think that what should happen is we should allow people to choose what they want to do and send them with our blessing, or leave them behind with our blessing. And so if we could do that, I think I would be grateful that happened. What will happen? I think it's more likely to devolve into what's happened in other denominations. We're going to see lawsuits. We're going to see hurt feelings. We're going to see broken relationships. And, the only thing I hold to is that God doesn't need us, and in fact, if we destroy ourselves and each other in the process, God will find another way to bring the reign of God to earth as it is in heaven. So, I don't want to say I'm cynical. I think I'm just being realistic that it's hard for me to picture how it doesn't get really nasty. So
yeah. Well, let's take a break and come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Jack Shitama, and Jack, I usually ask certain closing questions here, but I'm gonna tweak it a little bit for you. Rather than asking you if you were Pope for a day, how about if you were, I guess this is not an actual position. If you're Pope of the United Methodist Church, maybe, what would that day look like?
Well, I would probably try to see the problem. Yeah, if I had ultimate authority and could just do what I wanted in the United, I would probably try to institute that amicable separation. Not everybody would be happy with that, but I think it would allow for a lot smoother transition into the future. I do want to go back to if I were Pope for a day.
Sure.
I would steamroll the whole thing. I would allow priests to marry. I would allow women to be ordained, and I would remove all the bans on LGBTQ persons. So, if I were Pope, and I think Pope Francis, he might do the same, but I think he's a little more savvy of a leader / politician.
Yeah.
So,
but
if I had that chance, I'd do it.
Yeah. That reminds me, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, is how you saw leadership, for good or bad, happening through this whole process.
I see the healthy leaders as modeling this. So, for example, our bishop is Bishop Latrell Easterling, and she's over the Baltimore, Washington, and Peninsula Delaware conferences, which is Maryland, D.C., and the state of Delaware, a little part of West Virginia too. And she was asked recently by a group of people in public how she felt about two of her bishop colleagues leaving the denomination to go to the Global Methodist Church, and she said one of them she was actually very close to. She's going to miss conversations with him, and she sends him with her blessing. I just think that there's it can be modeled. It can be modeled, and so leaders who model this type of self-differentiation, this type of non-anxious presence, can be really helpful to the rest of us who are really anxious.
That's good to hear. That's helpful to hear. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see St. Francis. I also thought about John Wesley, but John Wesley, man, he was intense. Charles Wesley, maybe, these are the founders of Methodism. Yeah. Charles Wesley, I'd be interested just because he wrote all those songs to presumably bar tunes to local music. So anyway, I think those are a few that I've thought of.
Yeah. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think first of all, the pandemic, it's going to be hard for that to not be one of the defining moments. I think that we are getting close to the zenith, maybe the next 10 years of this division and conflict. If you do generational studies, one of the things I say about baby boomers, of which I'm a part of that generation, is they're idealists, and idealists don't compromise very well. And so and as my kids who are millennials tell me, that baby boomers ruined everything. So I think as baby boomers age out of life in general and power, I think the Gen X and the millennial generation especially are going to find a way to take us in a new direction, in a healthier direction. So I'm not blaming the baby boomers. Yeah. I'm just saying I think all of these things have come together, and I think that I believe in 10 years, say the early 2030s, I think our political divisions will be not so intense, and we'll find a different way to live in our world. And I think that's mainly due to young people. So I'm hopeful for our young people.
Yeah. I'll give you two ways to answer this if you want. I want to ask, what are your hopes for the future of the United Methodist Church? But if you'd like to also answer more broadly for Christianity, you're welcome to. But how would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, what's happened with Christianity is it became complacent and comfortable and inward looking, and so my hope is that Christianity will become outward facing again. I heard somebody say a long time ago, Christianity is one of the few organizations designed for the benefit of its non-members. And some people think of that in terms of proselytizing and making conversions. I think of it in terms of meeting the world where they are with God's love and grace. And so I hope that we see churches start to focus less on going back to where we were, less on numbers and butts and pews, and more on connecting with their communities and living out what they believe God's call is to serve them. And even if Christianity is much smaller because of that, I think it will be more powerful. And my study of Christian history, which is one of the subjects I loved, shows that it was always most faithful and vibrant when it was outside the majority, when it was outside the rings of power. So, so I don't think it's a bad thing that we may be in decline in Christianity. Christianity as we know it disappears, because I don't think that Christianity as we know it was as faithful as we should have been.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you have as I alluded to, you have a lot going on yourself that you work on. What are some of your projects that people can find and connect with you online?
Yeah, if they're interested in family systems theory, if they're interested in how to be a non-anxious presence, I think the podcast is the one. It seems that people find most helpful, and so I think that's a place to start. I think I'm a bit of an eclectic person, but I like to. I feel like I like to bring together these concepts of family systems theory, self-care, productivity, and try to bring them all together because these are the things that help me to function as a non-anxious presence. So I do have an email newsletter that goes out every Tuesday, and it's called 2 for Tuesday. I usually have a brief kind of devotional thing in there or something that I'm writing on, and then 2 recommendations. And I very seldom sell stuff in there. So if you're worried about me about getting sales emails all the time, you can try it out. You'll find out that it's really, I just kind of put it out there to try to be helpful to people.
And the website is what again?
thenonanxiousleader.com. No punctuation, just thenonanxiousleader.com.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Jack, really appreciate your time. Thanks for squeezing our conversation in today amongst your busy day, and really appreciate your perspectives. Always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks for the work you're doing.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.